This artifact documentation is brought to you by Squarespace. Many years have passed since I was first exposed to this type of artwork. The 1990s was absolutely saturated by it, and in my opinion, it influenced everything around it. The grim, the dark, watercolors desaturated by rust and patina. And while many artists would contribute to this body of work, this style, this movement, undeniably there is one man who stands out amongst the rest: John Blanche. So when the pigment alchemists over at the Army Painting Guild offered me these two ancient volumes to peruse from their archives and experiment with at my leisure, who was I to deny their power over me? I started, as is customary, at the beginning, with Volume 1. The packaging was exquisite. A glossy black slipcover over matte packaging depicting some distant ancient vista or future ancient world. And inside, I uncovered several seductive new artifacts. 10 bottles of paint, as well as accompanying documentation from the so-called fanatics over at the Guild of Army Painters. Beyond this, there is also included a cardstock print of the same distant vista depicted on the front cover. No doubt some prophecy revealed to the artist John Blanche in his dreams or visions. And on the back, lo, hark, there it'st a message from the sage himself. The venerable artist speaks of his inspirations, his methods, and offers an explanation for the existence of this volume. According to Master Blanche, these paints are to be used by one such as myself for illuminating new worlds. And so, who was I to say no to a message from the man himself? I proceeded to test out the paints one by one, and who better to test these paints out on than the humble dirt farmer? I think Master Blanche would approve. These specific peasants I purchased for myself an age and a half ago, for my private collection. They were sculpted by the expert artists over at Titan Troll and printed out for me by the factoriums over at Ott's Workshop, which I can highly recommend if you do not own a pre-3D printer. And affiliate links are provided down in the description should you wish to purchase peasants of your very own. But let's get on to painting, starting with the metallics. And honestly, nothing too much special here. It appears to be a nice warm gold color, I said to myself, but only later would the true power of this color be revealed to me. Beyond this, I decided to try out the two most basic colors in this set, Banshee Brown and Ivory White. Banshee Brown appears to be another, even darker addition to the ruddy brown super triad, Septumbriad, dreamed up by the paint alchemists over at the Army Painters Guild. The bottom line is, it's a nice dark brown and a nice ivory white. Great place to start. The brown has a little bit of a violet or lavender tinge to it perhaps, which is revealed when mixed together with the ivory and used as the base skin tone for our humble farmer. Adding successive amounts of ivory works well as a highlight and reveals a pallid skin tone that I think is most appropriate for a Blanche painting. I would end up returning to this skin tone later, but what of Moonbeam Yellow? Perhaps the most interesting color in this volume, and the one that had my attention the most at first. This is a warm, brilliant yellow, but when mixed together with our brown, several new shades of ochre are revealed. Between these three colors, the yellow, the brown, the ivory, there is much you can do already just by mixing them together in different amounts. A non-metallic metal gold would definitely be achievable with this palette if we so wished, but on this day, these colors were not used to paint brilliant golden armor. They were instead used to paint the simple cloth raiments of a peasant. I found this worked quite well, and a number of shades of this yellow ochre were easy to accomplish, and layering upwards from a brown mixed with yellow to pure yellow gave a nice effect, I think. But what of the cool colors included in this volume? John Blanche certainly isn't known for using too many cool colors in his work, and I think we often associate him more with ruddy browns, rusty oranges, yellows, and reds, the Zorn palette, if you will. But if you examine his full body of work, there are many blues, greens, and other cool colors to be found, especially ones of the desaturated variety. I found that this deep, dark green-blue and this humble gray were surprisingly impactful additions to this volume, the gray having surprising notes of, what is that, green? Magenta? It's hard to tell, but there's an interesting color mixed into this gray that helps it stand out from other, more boring gray colors. And the blue perhaps is one of the best versions of this deep desaturated blue-green that I have yet come across. It reminds me of the folk art paintings of my youth and some of the first miniatures I ever painted using humble apple barrel paints. No matter how you look at it, the sense of nostalgia with this paint set is quite strong. The blue applies well and would make for an excellent highlight color for pure black armor, and the gray looks excellent on stonework, and I'm sure I will find many other uses for it as well. The third cool color in this volume was Blighted Green, which I didn't think had a place on this specific peasant, so I saved it for later. And this leaves only 3 more colors in this volume to examine. But they are the more interesting ones, aren't they? First, a speed paint, Blood Moon Red, along with 2 inky shades. I first tested out the warmer wash, giving our peasant an overall coat of it, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, the result was not one that I was too happy with. It was a bit too glossy and didn't seem to add much to the model. I admit I am no longer accustomed to using standard washes. It has been quite a while since I used one of these, so I thought to myself, maybe a test over a lighter undertone, something a little bit more scientific, would be the answer. So giving several of my models a bright white spray from above using my airbrush, I then returned to the examination table and gave our washes a more proper, thorough inspection. But before we do that, I submit for your inspection some documentation from this video's wealthy patron, who continues to generously support our studies, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that we here at Howl Corp have been relying on for ages now to help archive our very important work. And their systems are incredibly easy to use. Just pick from one of their intricately designed, pre-made templates, or design your own template from scratch, using the machine spirits imbued into their brand new design intelligence system. We have been using our current website over at howlcorp.com to host a venerable collection of our painted artifacts, documentation, and reference diagrams, as well as our humble online shop, which has been extremely easy to use and offers a variety of payment options. So if you need a website, I implore you to check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And now, back to the examination table. A number of models were given this white overspray treatment for our ongoing studies, but I thought it best to test out our 3 washes on these 3 most hallowed seraphim. Angels that fell to earth, perhaps, or maybe they were merely sent to us for testing by our friends over at the ever-generous Heroescape Foundation. Who can say? And when I say 3 washes, yes, I mean 3 washes. I could no longer resist at this point. I unwrapped the second accursed volume of paints from its protected archival wrapping and inside I found something very similar to the first volume. The same documentation and ornamentation from the diligent fanatics over at the Army Painters Guild, as in the previous volume, but also 10 more paints, one of which is a wash. I thought it best to test out all 3 washes at once, and so after giving each angelic being a dry brush of ivory, I applied these washes one by one and soon began to see the utility of each. The warm, desaturated orange of our first wash I see now is perhaps deliberately made subtle, to be used to shade skin or other such things. The darkest wash reminds me somewhat of the oil of the province of Nuln, but perhaps a more green or sepia tone that lends it an aged look is mixed in here. Finally, my favorite of the 3 washes was the one that came in the second volume. If I were to name this paint, I would call it the subtle essence of the Howling Sands, as I can see so many uses for this subtle desaturated yellow parchment tone. But unlike the purity of its speed paint cousin Howling Sand, this wash is deeper, darker, and I think perfect to mimic the base parchment tone of John Blanche's masterwork watercolors. I would return to this thought later, but before anything else, I thought it best to test out any other wash-like paints, and yes, that means the 2 so-called speed paints. One was included in each volume. These function very much like any other speed paint, but 2 new colors are of course always welcome, and these 2 I found to be especially beautiful, especially potent. These were all of course tested out on black primed models with a heavy white spray from above. These specific models were graciously sent to us for examination by the diligent sculptors over at Corvus Belli, if you were wondering, and coincidentally, I think the crisp details of these metal models show the effectiveness of speed paints quite well. I have been pondering on this fact for quite some time, that perhaps there is further study to be had here about how speed paints may be particularly effective on metal models instead of plastic because of those sharp, heavy lines. But I digress, that is for another day. After testing these out, I found the red to be quite beautiful and a very close match for many of the master's paintings, especially his watercolors. This color is similar to 2 other speed paints, namely Bright Red and Blood Red. But Blood Moon Red is unique in its own way. Bright Red is perhaps the closest match, but it is not exact, and I think the difference is that Blood Moon Red is a little bit more desaturated. Perhaps adding one of the lighter browns to your Bright Red could get you a similar look, but I see why they made this. It is different enough from the other reds in the line. When I first unearthed this new dark blue speed paint, I thought it might just be a repackaging of one of our favorite speed paints over here at the Howl Corp archives, namely Tyrian Navy, one of only 3 speed paints that we have had to buy more of after going through our first bottle so quickly. But I am happy to say that I was wrong. This new dark turquoise is just that, a dark desaturated turquoise. Comparing this to the darker and more indigo hue of our beloved Tyrian Navy, we can definitely see a use for both going forward. And although I had not the time to fully test out every single color in Volume 2, it is worth noting that the included silver is also quite good, especially in combination with the warm gold from the first set. They seem made for each other. When combined together, these 2 desaturated and grimy metallics give a very 41st millennium look, if you know what I mean. And with all of this knowledge in hand, I then got into some more practical testing to see if I could replicate the look of any of Blanche's watercolors on a miniature. Test subject number 1, a Necrotech Wraith Rider, provided once again by the Renegades over at the Heroescape Foundation. My goal here was to achieve a similar look to John's watercolors, depicting the venerable tech priests of Mars. The steps taken were like several of the other models, a black prime and a spray of white from above, a dry brush of ivory, and then a thorough application of both metallic colors. With this complete, I wanted all negative space on the model to look like the sepia tone parchment of a Blanche watercolor, so a coat of our new sepia yellow wash was applied liberally. Once fully dry, a simple application of our new black wash was then used to darken the metallics and really tie the whole model together. And I applied this enthusiastically over all of the metallics, dabbing it on rather than brushing it for maximum impact. Once fully dry, I was extremely happy with how Blanchean the model looked, and although I definitely neglected to properly remove the mold lines on this figure, as you can see, I think these few initial steps could be a great, quick, fast recipe as a starting point for any sort of grimdark figure. But of course, I did not want to stop here, so I created a similar wash using Blood Moon Red and Speed Paint Medium, and tried splashing it on in different places that I wanted to look red as we see in some of Blanche's work. Overall, I may have gone a little too far with this. Perhaps applying less or thinning it down more would have been advisable, as it is such a strong, powerful color, but the look of John's watercolors is definitely there, I think. And after adding on some sketchy highlights in ivory, some pops of yellow and red, I feel the result looks maybe a little bit rushed, but the potential is definitely there. After further experimentation, I applied the same workflow to some of our humble peasants, and these results I am much more happy with. In conclusion, I believe both of these volumes to be very valuable, unique artifacts, and also nice sets of paints, which will definitely see use in the foundries of Howl Corp into the distant future. I look forward to experimenting with them more, especially as a limited palette, which I think is always fun to work with. The Guild of Army Painters, of course, do have replicas of these two artifacts up for pre-sale on their website. I provided a link down in the description to that. And if you'd like to see someone else's take on these paints, we implore you to check out our friend and ally, Jamie Dagger's video on the same subject, linked down in the description. And with that, thank you to all of our wondrous supporters, archivists, and royal archivists over at the Patreon for your ongoing support towards our research. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.